It is late fall. Remember, he had come down from Galilee to Judea probably mid to late September, and was there to celebrate with the Jews this is the last year of his, by the way. And he's there to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, which comes varying depending on the cycles of the moon each year. But generally on the Jewish calendar, it corresponds to our early to mid-October. And he remains in Judea after the Feast of Tabernacles. And he's there, he stays there through November in Judea. Now remember, that's the lower state of what used to be Israel proper. Under Roman times, you've got Judea to the south. Here's the River Jordan over here, the way you would be looking at it. I'm standing behind the map. It's the River Jordan. Over here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Judea. Just north of that is a region known as Samaria. Above that is the region known as Galilee, with the Sea of Galilee over here. Big lake that the River Jordan runs into and then runs south out of. Across the Jordan over here is a region known as the Decapolis. That's Greek. It means the 10 cities. And Jesus, when he's in Galilee, would a couple of times go over and minister in the Decapolis to those cities. Then, if you come down to Judea, on that side of the Jordan, you go through a region known as Gilead. And that's where the 2.5 tribes in the Old Testament remained when the rest of the tribes of Israel under Joshua went in and conquered all of this. So there's Gilead. South of Gilead is the ancient land of Moab, Ammon, which in Roman times is called Perea. P-E-R-E-A. We're going to be talking about Perean ministry. Jesus, sometime in that September, left Galilee, where there's Nazareth and Capernaum, and he has always had his biggest ministry in Galilee. He went down through Samaria to Jerusalem, stopped off, you'll recall these. He had stopped off in southern Galilee at a place called Caesarea Philippi. That's where Peter, he had asked Peter, whom do men say that I am? Peter said, well, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're, Jeremiah or the prophet Moses spoke of. Well, who do you say I am? I say that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says to Peter, that's up here at Caesarea Philippi. Jesus says to Peter, well, flesh and blood, blessed are you, Peter, because flesh and blood didn't tell you this, but the Spirit of my Father. Then Jesus goes on and announces for the first time, this is on the September trip down to Jerusalem. For the first time, Jesus says, but don't you know I'm going to be taken in Jerusalem? And the chief priests and Pharisees and wicked men are going to crucify me. Peter grabs him by the arm and spins him around, it seems, and says, this shall never be. Far be it from you. And Jesus shakes loose and says, get thee behind me. In other words, you don't lead me, I lead you. And I tell you, I'm going to the cross. Get thee behind me. Satan. Why are you calling me Satan? Peter had said. Because you don't savor the things of God, you savor the things of man. Now that strange little dialogue happened in Caesarea Philippi. That's when Jesus first tells Peter, blessed are you, for you don't listen to the things of man, but the things of God. Get thee behind me, Satan, he says in the next breath, because you don't savor the things of God, you savor the things of man. So Peter's going to walk with Jesus, continuing this trip, wondering, conflict in his heart and in his mind. Do I hear from God rather than man? Do I love the things of God rather than man? Peter is in a conflict. They journey on down to Jerusalem. Luke says it takes them 8 days, leaving from Galilee to get to Jerusalem. So it's not that long a trip, but it takes them a while. Then we find that when Jesus gets to Jerusalem, he argues with the Pharisees in a few places, and then, we'll see it tonight, he goes with his disciples across the river Jordan into Perea. Now, where they come to in Perea, it's right across the river. You leave Jerusalem, you head toward the Jordan, you come to Jericho. If you leave Jericho, this is Elijah's old route on his way to go across Jordan to be caught up into heaven. If you leave Jericho, you come to the river Jordan. That's the famous place where Joshua and the children of Israel crossed Jordan. It's also the famous place where Elijah and Elisha crossed back across Jordan. You cross Jordan there, and there is a mountain that rises, the ancient mountain Nebo. Another place that was important there is Beth Abara, which means the house of the crossing. It's where Joshua had set up the 12 stones when they crossed the river Jordan all those centuries ago. And it became a shrine, a memorial, and Joshua had told the people, generations to come, your children will ask you, what mean this pile of 12 stones? You tell them, that's where we came across. So it's monumentalized. Somebody built a house over it. Now there's a village around that monument known as Beth Abara, the house of the crossing. And it's at the foot of Mount Nebo, up on Mount Nebo, where Moses died at the end of Deuteronomy. And God hid his body somewhere. Where Elijah and Elisha crossed at that same place and went up on that same mountain, standing somewhere near Moses' bones. And John the Baptist had come along and was baptizing. We're told in the Gospel of John where John the Baptist did all his baptizing. At Beth Abara. Same place. Near where Moses had died. Where Joshua and the children of Israel came across Jordan. Where Elijah and Elisha crossed. Went up on Mount Nebo. Elisha had come back down. Now John the Baptist is there baptizing at that same place. Now Jesus leaves Jerusalem now in the September. This is just, let's see, October, November, December, January, February, March, and then April, early April, he'll be crucified. This is 6 months before his crucifixion. And he gets to Jerusalem, takes him a few days, and then is there for a day or two, and then decides to go over to Beth Abara. And he will be spending several days there. While he is there, he of his disciples up to that same mountain, and guess who will appear to them? You got it. The two men in the Old Testament who disappeared from that mountain. Moses disappeared from men's sight, dying and being buried by God there, and Elijah caught up at that same spot. Jesus takes his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, up there. The 3 who are most in inner contention as far as we can tell. Peter wondering, do I love the things of God or the things of man? He told me one thing, then he told me another thing. A week ago, just the same day, he was telling me that he's going to be crucified. James and John are in conflict. They had asked Jesus recently when they had come down on these Samaritans. Jesus had told them, you know not what manner of spirit you are of. You want the spirit of Elijah to kill people? What manner of spirit is that? Seems like Jesus is saying something rough about Elijah right there. Then he adds, for man did not come to take away men's lives, but rip along with Peter, James and John with Peter, also wondering. He said, he seemed to say that to want the spirit of Elijah It was a bad thing that Elijah killed people and he didn't kill people. What Jesus is actually saying is this: look, I got more power than Moses had. I've got more power than Elijah had, than David had, more wisdom than Solomon had. Nobody ever had as much power as I've got. All those fellows killed people. I've got more power than all of them put together. All power in heaven and earth has been committed unto me, and yet I kill no one. Jesus, the most powerful man in the Bible, never uses his power to kill anybody. Rather, with all that power, he allows himself to be killed. And that's what he just has been announcing a week earlier. And he had started condemning the Pharisees and the lawyers, saying to them, because many had gathered around in the Pharisees' house, and Jesus had said to them, all of the blood of the prophets, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zacharias, will be required of this generation. And he gets up and leaves that house and heads where I've been talking to, across Jordan past Bethabara, to urge him vehemently and to provoke him to speak of many things, laying wait for him. And seeking to catch something out of his mouth that they might accuse him. Now, these are people from Jerusalem. Up in Galilee, for over a year, there's been Pharisees up there calling in Jerusalem scribes. Come on, this Nazarene that's preaching here, this Galilean. But now he's down in their territory. We find that this Pharisee had invited him to breakfast, probably setting up a trap, and others coming around listening. Let's see if we can get him to say something. Trying to get him to say something. And now we have this. At this point, I'm using the old classic Robertson's, A.T. Robertson's Harmony of the Gospels. He might be wrong in some places, but he's tried to blend chronologically passages from Matthew and Mark and Luke, and here's something John said probably went in there. Here's something John said probably went in there, and he's trying to get the chronology. I don't agree with him altogether, but I'm following his chronology. Let's see, which verse is that there? Wait just a second. Let's see. Where did I mark this in the Robertson? You folks bear with me, please. Man, I was all ready for this and had my finger in it. Well, go up a verse, Brother Chris, to verse 41. Go up another verse, verse 40. Let's see if that's what I want. Yeah, okay. So, according to John, right after giving this teaching, Jesus leaves Judea and crosses over Jordan into the place where John at first baptized. And there he abode. That means he stayed there for some time. This is across Jordan in Perea, which includes Mount where Moses had at last gazed into the promised land and then died. Jesus is there and he abides there. And guess what happens? Next verse. And many resorted to him. They come from Judea. Many do. And they say, John did no miracles. But all things that John spake of this man were true, people. Well, there are people who had been there at Perea, at that spot on the River Jordan, who had heard John preaching and baptizing and had seen Jesus baptized there 2.5 years earlier. And they followed Jesus out. Next verse. What is he? Well, we go back to Luke now for that. Luke will give us several chapters of what Jesus is doing during the 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month, that he's over here in Perea. in the shadow of Mount Nebo. And I've already said one of the things he does is take Peter, James, and John up that mountain and give them the transfiguration experience, which we've already spoken about, where they not only see Moses, and then they disappear. The miracle is not that Elijah and Moses appeared, but that they disappeared, leaving Jesus only. And a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear ye him." Those three pondering those things have come down from the mountain, found a boy, epileptic or something, throws himself into the water and into the fire when he has these fits. The boy's father had told Jesus, said, "Well, your disciples couldn't do anything to help him." And Jesus said, "Yeah, this kind comes not out but by prayer and fasting. Here, let me take hold of the boy." And Jesus heals the boy, casts the devil out of him in the vernacular of that time, and restores him to his father. And we find that many other miracles he does while he's there in Perea. Is this interesting to anyone? Trying to build a timeline here. And so Luke 12, no, pardon me. Now there were some present at that very season which told him of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. Wow, let's just stop there a minute. It's one of the few times we get some current events of the daily news that was going on when people were talking about other things beside what Jesus was doing. Luke mentions it. Pilate, who is this Pilate fellow? Well, we're just now meeting him in a mention from Luke. He is the new Roman governor of Palestine. The previous governor, Cyrenius. What we know of Pilate is that he was a prosecutor no longer and take the governor's post in Judea. And you can from there lead investigations all over Jewish Palestine. Because we've got a problem. There is some group of secret Jewish assassins. But they are assassinating some of our Roman officials and causing havoc among the Roman officers that we've got all over Palestine. They have some crazy idea of a Jewish hope, that the Jews will one day rule the world and they're a magical king from heaven, the Messiah or whatever they call it, is going to come and lead them in victory to destroy Rome. I want you to go find out who these secret operatives are and put them to death. Pilate has now been, by the time we're reading, Pilate has been in Jerusalem for a little over when he had ridden into Jerusalem to begin with to take the Roman. They had the banners with Caesar's name on them and the depiction of the Roman eagle and all that stuff, and had marched into Jerusalem. The gates had opened, but the high priest had had all the Jews turn their backs. Pilate rode in silence. No applause, no fanfare, no clapping from the Jews. They greeted him with their backs turned. Pilate was very angry about this. Not that they're despising me, but that these Jews, I've been sent to govern them, they're despising Caesar. And this became a big deal for him. He and the high priest were at odds. They won't actually speak to one another in agreement until the day Jesus is crucified, Luke will tell us. Pilate has already begun his investigations, and you know what? It's been revealed through torture, through inquisition of different Jews, that most of the assassins come from a region to the north called Galilee. And Pilate has found out that Galilee is the hotbed of this secret society of assassins that want to terrorize the Romans and drive them out. You know, in fact, all of Jesus' 12 apostles except for one, the others were Galileans, and we'll find that even after Jesus is crucified, buried, resurrected, and walks glorified on earth for 40 days and is about to ascend up into heaven from the Mount of Olives just outside of Jerusalem. The last question his 11 surviving disciples, is this now when you're going to be the Messiah and lead us and all the rest of former Israel into rebellion against the Romans and restore us to the glory that Solomon once had? See, even that extremist view was still in the minds of Jesus' disciples even then. He said, nope, nothing of the kind. Here's what you're going to do. Go on into Jerusalem to an upper room, not to rule over men, unto all men, beginning into Jerusalem and then all Judea, and then even in Samaria, which you Jews hate, and then to the uttermost parts of the earth. And with those words, Jesus is saying, well, anyway, told Jesus about Galileans that Pilate had put to death, mingled with their sacrifices. Another version of this says that Pontius Pilate had put to death a number of Galileans, that he had them all executed, beheaded. And he did it in the street across from the temple steps at the very moment that the high priest was offering up the evening sacrifice lamb. Just as the lamb was being slain on the brass altar at the top of the steps, Pilate had these men beheaded as kind of an irony to show you can kill your lambs to atone for yourselves, you Jews. And so these disciples, what do you think of that? And Jesus, verse 2, Jesus to them, do you think, next verse, brother, yeah. Likewise perish. That's the next verse, Brother Chris, I'm sorry. You will see Jerusalem dismantled. The Romans are coming with their whole vast 10th legion. There will, before some of you taste of death, you'll see it. When does it happen? It does happen in 70 A.D. About 35 years later, the 10th legion of Rome will come, and they'll tear Jerusalem down, and not one brick will be left standing upon another. They'll so thoroughly demolish it. Of thousands of zealot Jews, extremist, anti-Roman Jews, will be put to death. Jesus will soon, 6 months from now, have his own talk with Pontius Pilate. And Pilate will ask him, I've heard that you're a Galilean. Do you claim to believe me? I'd whistle up my soldiers and they'd come with swords. I'd have been training all these disciples of mine for warfare. And I'd call on them to come here today to rescue me and make war against. And strange, Jesus doesn't say against the Romans when he talks to Pilate. He says against the Jews, meaning the Jerusalem crowd that would not obstinance mean all Jews. But this particular bunch of Jews, what does repent mean? It means to rethink, to change your mental outlook. Even his disciples have not finished repenting. I've already pointed out to you. Even Jesus' own disciples are still murmuring to one another, saying, pretty soon he's going to tell us to take up the sword and fight the Romans, and we believe he's the Messiah, and he's going to lead us as the Messiah into battle against these Romans and restore the kingdom to Israel. His disciples mutter that amongst one another. When Jesus would tell them other things, they'd scratch their heads and look at one another and say, this is a hard saying. Who can receive this? And it wouldn't be until much later, after he's gone and ascended into heaven, that some of the disciples will rethink and retalk their ideologies and say, he didn't mean any of that at all. And they'll finally begin to understand once the Holy Ghost comes upon them to lead them into all truths. The people of Israel have a very special purpose. That unto them were committed the oracles of God. What would we know about God had it not been for them? Their writings, their failures, their risings again, and their failures again. We get from them the example for us to follow and understand about God. And so, Jesus tells them, yeah, Pilate killed those guys. The Romans will kill you guys in like manner if you don't change your way of thinking. Who are the Romans? They're just people. They're just Gentiles, just like the Syrians and the Arabians and the Romans. Come, that I might raise you up to reach their souls and their hearts. And he says now in verse 4, by the way, just a few days ago, this Tower of Siloam fell on 18 people. They died, probably bricklayers, somebody working on a tower, somebody building a wall and using shoddy building materials, or something went wrong. The architect didn't have enough support for it, and the thing fell over, and 18 of them were killed. Do you think that those 18 were sinners above all men that dwelt in Jerusalem? In other words, we're back to this. And they found out the man had been born blind, and the disciples had asked Jesus, somebody must have done some terrible sinning for that man to be born blind, for God to curse him with that. Was it his parents that sinned, or was it he who had sinned? Now, both he had the man born. Or for that matter, why weren't you born blind before you committed some sins? And do you know Jesus wouldn't even answer their dumb question, except to say to them, neither that man's parents nor he sinned. Well, that wasn't true. Everybody sins in some way or another. All men are sinners and have come short of the glory of God. All have sinned. But Jesus means the man didn't sin enough for God to strike him with blindness, nor did his parents sin enough for that. It wasn't the reason he's blind. I'm not going to tell you the reason he's born blind. You wouldn't understand it or believe it. Of course, Jesus knew about genetic problems. He knew about viral problems, bacterial problems, different things that happen to traumatic child in the womb. We don't know what. But Jesus wasn't about to go into a medical lesson with them. He just said, all you have to know about this man's blindness is that it's an opportunity for God now to be glorified in healing him. We've got this thing even amongst us today, this same kind of superstition. Something bad happens to someone, a hurricane hits, an earthquake hits, a volcano erupts, loss of human life, and we get up and said, oh, God paid them for that. But we ignore the fact that right down the street from where we live, there's a bunch of people just as bad as we thought those were. I sure hope God doesn't have a volcano go off here in our neighborhood to kill them, and we get caught up in it, or a tidal wave, or a hurricane, or an earthquake. Amen, Brother Pat. It's easy for us to be glib and think that every bad thing is a work of God, and every good thing is a work of God, blessing us but cursing them. I remember when Katrina hit New Orleans, which had been, I'm from Louisiana. Spent a lot of time in New Orleans growing up, and Katrina hit. I was living in Chattanooga at the time. Katrina hit. I went out to get the mail the day after. My neighbor was at the mailbox and said to me, well, did you hear about what God did in New Orleans there? That hellhole. And I said, yeah, hellhole, brother. You're thinking of Bourbon Street, aren't you? When you say hellhole. We drove down there through there one time, and we went and walked on through there just to see. Isn't it something? All the holy roller and Baptist and pious tourists in the country, if they visit New Orleans, they take a walk down Bourbon Street so they can, I'd never say anything. Not realizing right there in Chattanooga, they got their own Bourbon Street area with all those kind of clubs, and you'll find them all over the country. But the problem with Katrina is Bourbon Street was left high and dry. But guess what was destroyed? About 20 churches. one of the best missionary shipping centers in the nation, 2 Bible colleges, and the most extensive Christian book library in the South. All of those things wiped out. Well, that's just collateral damage. What God was really after was that wickedness in New Orleans. Well, if that's the way God does, I sure hope He doesn't hit us around here for our wickedness. But we love all that, and that's what Jesus is talking about. Every time some tragedy happens and a few people are beheaded by the Roman law or somebody else, seems like just an accident happened, we think there's divine favor in it or divine will in it. Some things you know just happen. Gosh, I had a lot to say and I'm out of time already. Oh no, I believe either God or the devil is involved in something. I was pastoring a church in another city years ago, and a fine young man, newlywed, 2 or 3 years married, little baby son just born, and he's out barefoot washing his car, all wet, and he's using a shop vac, and the cord gets in the puddle of water, and he can't let go. It's just big, strong football playing type. But he falls over and can't let go of it, lying in the electrocuting water until his heart stopped. And his wife found him a half hour later, dead too long to revive. So we had to do his funeral. Our whole church was crying at the news. One little group of ladies came to me and said, the devil did that. And I said, y'all can think that if you want. I'm not prepared to say that. This guy had given his life to God. Well, you're not going to blame God for it, are you? I said, no, I blame the laws of electricity. I kind of blame him, sadly. He should have had sense not to bring an electrical cord into a deep puddle of water that he was standing barefoot in. Oh no, it's either God or the devil did it. One or the other. You got to make your mind up, Pastor. That's the kind of question that Jesus is dealing with when his disciples bring him this thing about Pontius Pilate. Am I making any sense to anyone? Coming up, still in Perea. And he'll be in Perea for a few weeks. He'll still be in Perea. I showed you in John chapter 10, the last few verses, how he went over to Perea at this time, right? And he abode there, was there for a long time. And he takes the disciples up to the Mount of Transfiguration. He'll still be there in that region with bigger and bigger crowds coming to him until he's got bigger crowds than he ever had up north in Galilee the year before. And over here in Jerusalem, not far away, they'll be so upset that down here in the south, around Judea and Perea, big crowds of Judeans are going over to him. They're really getting upset. And Jesus will still be in Perea when he gets a message from a little town near Jerusalem, 2 miles from Jerusalem, called Bethany. Our brother Lazarus is sick and nigh unto death. Please come. And Jesus won't come. And then a day or two later, another message, Lazarus is dead. It's taken 2 days for the message to get to him. He leaves the next morning, takes 2 days to get to Bethany. So we're coming up to the raising of Lazarus. Is this interesting to you? That happens while he's in Perea, where John was baptizing, where Joshua crossed, where Moses died, where Elijah and Elisha crossed, and Elisha crossed back, and where John did his baptizing. All of that right there, where Jesus had been baptized. All inside of that same pile of 12 rocks. that John the Baptist had pointed to and said, don't you know God is able to raise from these stones children unto Abraham? Hallelujah. And it'll be very soon. I've got a minute to say this. While he's there preaching in Perea all these days, you can climb Mount Nebo and see Jerusalem. So take you a couple of days walking. But Jesus will be accosted by a young man who'll say, Master, I want you to rebuke my brother for me. Our daddy died and my brother's taken all the inheritance. Tell him to share the inheritance with me. And that'll be one of the prayers Jesus refuses to answer. He'll say, man, who made me a judge over you and your brother? Why are you coming to me with this? Don't you have enough spirit and love inside of you and wisdom to work out your problems with your brother? You want me to get interfering in that? You should know enough how to deal with other people. And that's very telling that only Luke gives us that. But as Jesus taking these people away from their rather superstitious ideas about God and what God must do, and if we pray long enough and loud enough and enough of us gather together, we can cause God to do something. When really God says, what I want to pour into you is my spirit, wisdom, understanding, and love, so that you can go out among men and do the right thing and show forth the praises of Him who has called you out of those darknesses into this marvelous light. God bless you. Thank you for your attention tonight.